Good afternoon, holyJS. My name is Erik Rasmussen, and I'm here today to talk to you about everyone's favorite part of web development, forms. Now, there's no getting around it. Forms are hard. But why are they so hard? Well, forms are one of the most complex parts of a web application. It's a time I call a time of maximum user interaction. Because most of the user interaction on a web page are with scrolling with the mouse and clicking. But with form interaction, it's different. You're using the keyboard, potentially typing many keys per second, resulting in rapid state change. And Form UI needs to update quickly, both the input, but good Form UI needs to be constantly validating the form data on every key press. And the validation errors need to flow down to wherever they need to be displayed. And whether you're using React's unidirectional data model or some other framework's bidirectional data binding, as a developer, it's important that we be able to hook into the form data as it's flowing through the application and perform calculations and potentially modify the form state. And lastly, there's just so much form state. And what do I mean by form state? Well, things like which field currently has focus, which fields are dirty, dirty meaning that the value has changed since it was initialized, which fields have errors, which fields has a user visited. Maybe we don't want to display an error until the user has been to the field and then left the field. Are we currently running some sort of asynchronous validation? Like if you're doing a registration form and the user picks a username, maybe before they even get down to the submit button, we want to check with the server to see if that name is available. And it's good to let the user know that something's happening. Maybe you put a little spinner or something. And likewise, are we currently submitting? Now that we submit our forms with Ajax, it's important to give the user feedback. Maybe disable the submit button or put a spinner or something. And then after that, have we tried to submit and receive submit errors from the server? And do we have errors specific to each field, and how do we display them, and things like that? And then, which fields have changed since the last submit errors came back? Maybe you want to hide the error after the user has made an attempt to fix the error. So your project manager comes to you and is like, yeah, I'm going to need you to go ahead and manage all of this form state. And as developers, we're just like, okay. So, okay, you say, we get it. Forms are hard. But why listen to me? Well, a few years ago, I was building a project with React that was going to require several long, complicated forms. And I set about trying to figure out how to best organize my form data. And there was no real insight from the industry at that point. I was coming off of Angular 1's two-way data binding, and the one-way flow in React seemed complicated. And the React docs were very little help, because all the React docs tell you how to do is how to keep your input's value in component state to make a controlled input. And to this day, that's about all the help that the React docs give you. And this was about the time that Redux was becoming popular as a way to manage application state. And Redux also lets you mutate it in a React-friendly unidirectional way. And at this time, I was active in the Reactive Flux Slack channel, back before they got too big for Slack. And I remember watching the creators of Redux, Dan and Andrew, talking back and forth about how best they were making their design decisions. And I sent a message to Dan. I said, so is Redux going to be able to handle dispatching an action and changing the app state and updating all the components on every single key press? Is it going to be that fast? And the answer he gave me was perfect. He was like, well, I don't know, give it a try. So I did, and I wrote a little reducer to keep track of my form state, and it worked out pretty well. So I released it as a library called Redux Form. And it quickly became clear that this was a problem that many people were having. It clearly filled a need, and it became quite successful. So over about 3 years, I spent hundreds of hours implementing feature requests and fixing bugs and merging PRs. And one time I even did a complete ground-up rewrite to enable some features that were impossible with the initial architecture. And I spend a lot of time generally thinking about how forms work in React and what the best practices are. And one thing you learn from open sourcing a tool that has fixed one little problem for you is just how many different variations and use cases other developers have. And I had a lot of people coming to me and say, oh, your tool is so close to perfect for what I need, but there's just this one thing. Can we like add a config parameter so that later in another part of the process it does something slightly different? And I got a lot of feedback like that. And Redux Form grew and grew, both in functionality and in monthly downloads. Now it's well over 1 million downloads a month and seems to continue to grow. But it also grew in bundle size. With every new edge case that someone tacked on to cover their needs, the bundle size for everyone got bigger. And let me tell you, if there's one thing the internet is good for, it's about receiving feedback. I got quite a lot of feedback about Redux Form, and I'd like to go over a couple of the primary complaints. First, you mean it's only for React? People are using Redux in Angular and other places, and why can't I manage my form state with Redux in other frameworks? And the answer is Redux Form is a little too tightly coupled to the React Redux architecture. Next, you mean I have to use Redux? I've already got a whole application state management system for my application, and just because I need a form solution, you mean I have to install a whole new application state form management solution? And also, later, after my initial contact, both Dan and Andrew are on the record as saying that they think that dispatching an action on every key press just to manage one state for one input is a little bit overkill. Next, why is there so much re-rendering? Why does my form have to re-render when a part of the form state changes that I don't care about? I'd like to only re-render when the things that my UI needs to know about change. And lastly, it's over 26K gzipped. That is a huge library to add to your bundle. All those years of saying, sure, I'll merge your PR for your specific use case, it all added up. So like, if you're making a login form or a simple thing, you shouldn't have to force your users to download all of the code to manage complex arrays of fields and stuff. It's just too much. So I spent many months thinking about these problems, and I came up with a solution. So what would the perfect form library look like? Well, what if the inner engine that manages your form state was pure JavaScript? This would allow the library to be framework agnostic, where you could use it with Vue or with Angular or wherever, or whatever the next framework that's coming down, that is coming ahead of us. And it could potentially outlive React itself. Whatever we're going to be using in 10 years is not going to look like the React of today. But if it's just pure JavaScript, it could potentially do the same task that far into the future. And what if you could subscribe to specific slices of your form state and only be notified when those change? This is a well-known pattern in computer science called the observer pattern, where you can subscribe to something and be notified. And what if rather than being one big Swiss Army knife that you had to carry all the tools around with you to just use one of them, what if it was modular and you could pick and choose the different bits of functionality that you wanted to use for whatever your particular form use case was? And last summer I began working on such a library, and almost 1 year ago today I released it. It's called Final Form. Final Form is a standalone form state management engine that's framework agnostic. You can subscribe to slices of form state at either the form or the field level. And it has plugin capabilities with plugins called mutators and decorators that allow any arbitrary additional functionality to be added on an as-needed basis. And has 0 dependencies. There's no TypeScript helpers, there's no Lodash, there's no deep equals, it's all self-contained. And the entire form engine is only 4.6K gzipped. And because I love React, it comes with a companion library called React Final Form. And all React Final Form is React bindings to Final Form. It maps form and field state to render props, and it handles React synthetic events. It knows how to get the value out of an event. And it's even smaller. It's less than 3K gzipped. So together, they form a total React form solution that is 7.5K gzipped. So how does that compare to other form libraries out there today? Well, at the top here, you've got Redux Form, the big giant. Also popular is a library called Formic that's considerably smaller. And then React Final Form and Final Form together are even smaller. And when researching this slide, I discovered this library called Informed that looks pretty neat, but it doesn't quite seem to be at feature parity yet, so I expect it's going to grow a little bit. So if bundle size is important to you, and it should be, it's a factor to consider when choosing a form library. So let's look for a moment at what the Final Form API looks like. First, you create a form instance. You give it the initial form values if you have any. And then you provide a function to call when the form is submitted. And this is only going to get called if the form passes validation. And the third argument is a validation function that will take all of the form values and return an object of errors that's the same shape as the values for the entire form. And to subscribe to FormState, and you can do this as many times as you wish, you call form.subscribe. And if you've ever worked with observables, this pattern is going to be familiar, where the return value of subscribe is the function to call to unsubscribe. And the first argument is the callback that's going to get called whenever the form state changes. And the second argument is an object of Booleans that are the specific parts of the form state that you want to be informed about. So in this way, you have to actually pick a la carte all the different pieces that you want to know about. To create a field, you call register field, and this both tells Final Form about the existence of that field and also subscribes to the state for updates to that field. And notice again that this adheres to this subscriber pattern of returning the unsubscribe function. And the first argument is the name of your field, and this is a string, but it can be like a deep path to using dot and bracket syntax to some arbitrary place in your object of form values. The next argument is the function that's going to be called when your field state changes. And this is called with the field state that you've subscribed to, but it's also called with these event hooks, blur, change, and focus, that need to be connected to whatever the input is to make it work with Final Form. And just like with form subscription, the final argument is a list of exactly which bits of field state you want to be notified about. And finally, we have submit and reset functions. The submit will only go through if all the registered fields are valid. And there's a couple other things like reinitialize, and you can do batched updates and things. But what I've shown here is the primary API. However, if you're lucky enough to use React, forget all of that. It's all done for you. There are three components in the React Final Form API. There's form, which wraps the entire form and provides form state to a render prop. There's field, which registers a field and provides field state and callback functions to a render prop. And then there's something called FormSpy, which provides a way to read form state from within your form without re-rendering the entire form. Now, you all understood that sentence, right? If that's not clear, it will become clear soon when I show you an example. So, enough reading the docs. Let's do some live coding. See if this works. Okay. So here we have a standard hot reloading React development system here. So when I save over here, it hot reloads over here. So let's build a form. So first we're going to import form and field from React Final Form. And then let's put our form down here. So we're going to have a form. And the only required prop here is an onSubmit. And I'm just going to give it this function up here that it's going to wait for half a second and then alert out the values that we give it. And with form, you can either provide a render prop as a prop called render, or you can give the render prop as a child, like I now prefer to do. And this is going to be given your form state, but it's also going to be given a function called handle submit, which is designed to be given to your HTML object here. Okay, so let's create a row here for our first field. We'll call it first name. And rather than put an input here, we're going to use a field. And the field requires a name. And here we can either provide a render prop as a prop called render, or as a child, or we can provide some other React component, or optionally we can give a string that is either input text area or select that will give us one of the standard HTML inputs. Okay, we hit save, and we're starting to look like a form over here. By the way, if you're not running Prettier every time you save your code, you're doing it wrong. Prettier is amazing. Okay, so I like having placeholders. I think it's a nicer user experience. First name. And let's add a submit button. Oops, on submit, type. Okay, so now we can type in our form here, and this is a controlled input, and we can hit submit, and it's going to wait a second and alert the values. So let's add another field. And let's be creative and call it last name. Okay, so now we have first name and last name, and this works just fine. So also with our form state that our form component here is giving us, we have other things like dirty and our values and are we submitting and stuff. So let's use submitting and values. And down here on our submit button, we can say we can disable it when the submitting is true. And submitting will be true for the lifetime of the promise that is returned from these onSubmit. And let's down here, just for demo purposes, let's print out our values. So we can see our values here change in real time. So as I type in here, the values are changing, and when I hit submit, the submit button is disabled until I dismiss this dialog here. Okay. The problem is, if we refresh, we can submit an empty value, so we need some validation. Now, there's two ways to do validation with React Final Form. Up here on your form component, you can provide a validate function that takes all your values and returns an object of your errors. And this is my preferred way of doing it. The reason being that if you're using Node on the back end, then you can actually share this function between the client and the server so that when the server receives your submission, it can double check that it passes the validation. Normally, that's not going to be a big problem because people aren't going to be able to submit unless it passes client-side validation. But someone could potentially spoof an AJAX request, and you want to make sure your data is valid. However, for this demo, we're going to use field level validation. And for that, you pass a validate function on every field, and that takes, and that takes a value, and if it's valid, it returns undefined, otherwise it returns the error. So if value is truthy, return undefined, otherwise required. And of course, with this, you would want to, you wouldn't want to type that out in every single field that you wanted to make required. You would come and make like a required function. And if you need more than one rule, you can compose these little bits together to make complex rules. And there are libraries out there that do exactly that. So down here, let's pass required. And we'll make last name required too. Okay, so now our fields, both fields are required. So now when I hit submit, nothing happens because we can't submit our invalid form. But of course the user doesn't know that because we're not displaying the error messages yet. So where are these errors? How do we get to the errors? Well, errors are part of field state. So to get to the errors, we need to have the field component give it to us. So let's look at what the field state looks like. So to get more detailed field state, you can't use this shortcut of component input. You have to use a render prop. So let's take our field state, and for now, let's just print it out like we're doing down below. Okay, so all of this here is our field state that final form is handling for us. It's divided into two main sections. Input is all the bits that you need to give to your actual input to make it work. You've got your name and your value, and notice even though our value is undefined, it's giving us the empty string to make it a controlled component. If you give undefined to a React input, then it's not going to be controlled. And the second part is meta. This is all the work that you don't have to do because the library is doing it for you. You've got active, which is the field currently focused. You've got dirty, has the value changed since it was initialized. And look, there's our error. So we know we need to get our error out of meta.error. And then you've got valid and invalid, which are opposites, and that's just whether or not you have an error. And then down here we have two things called touched and visited. And these are terms that I came up with when I wrote Redux Form. Visited means that the user has focused the input. Once the user focuses on the input, the visited will become true for the lifetime of the component. And touched is that the user has focused and then blurred the component, and then it's true for the lifetime of the component. And those are useful for when to display error messages. And then down here we have placeholder. We have any additional thing, that you pass to here. So any props you give there appear down here. And this is really useful if you want to encapsulate a way to do a row or something, but you need to give extra config parameters to a specialized input component. So let's watch what happens to our field state as we interact with the form. So when I give this field focus, what's going to happen? Well, active is going to become true, and visited is going to become true. Okay, that happened. And when I type in the form, what's going to happen? Well, dirty is going to become true, and our error is going to go away, which means valid and invalid are going to switch. And we're going to get the value showing up here. So now dirty is true, and we have a valid. The field is valid. And notice that if I remove that, it goes back to being pristine, and yeah, pristine is the opposite of dirty, by the way. And it has the error. So in this way, and when I blur the field, active is going to become false, and touched is going to become true. Okay? So here we can see how the field state is changing with our interactions with the form. So now that we know all of this, how can we get our error to display? Well, I like to destructure field state into input and meta. And then let's see, we also have placeholder we have to pass along. And rather than this printout, we're going to do the whole row, and I'll show you why in a moment. Oops. So our label is first name. And here, rather than our field, we're going to put our input. And this is where having all of this stuff that the input needs. Also in this input thing that JSON stringify doesn't print out are event hooks, our on blur and our on focus and our on change. So all of that stuff is in there. So to hook up this input, all I have to do is this. I spread that object into the props of the input, and then it's connected. That's all we have to do. And in this case, we have placeholder that we want to pass along to. Okay, and then we can come up here and get rid of this guy. And great, it looks like it's still working. We have our input. But of course, we still don't have any errors. So as you might recall, the errors were under meta.errors. So meta.error. So if we have an error, then let's display it. Okay, so now our error is displayed, and when we type, it goes away. But this is not very nice. It's not very nice user experience to immediately tell people that there's errors in their forms. At least give them a chance to fill it out the form properly. So that's why these visited and touched flags come in handy. So like if we used visited, okay, now the form looks all nice and pretty, but then when we focus on the input, we see the error. And there are some use cases where you might want to do that, but I think that's still a little too aggressive. So I like to use touched. So this way, the form looks fine. The user comes in to start doing something, and if they don't do it right and they tab away, then you have the error to say, hey, come back up here and fix this. So let's copy this for our last name. So now we have our last name, and as we tab through these, it's going to say it's required. And the other nice thing about using touched is that if the user doesn't focus on your fields, but they just go straight to the submit button, final form, when a submission fails because of validation errors, it's going to mark all the fields as touched. So when I try and submit, all the errors are displayed. And it all still works. So this is more or less how you're going to build forms in React, no matter what library you use. Actually, hold on, one other thing I wanted to show you. With the benefit of having the whole row is that you can do things like use you can use active to make the whole row sort of glow, so that it really pulls the user's attention to where they need to be focusing. So, like I said, this is about the way you would build form with any library. But now I want to show a little bit about what makes Final Form different, and that's this subscribing. You're able to fine-tune all your re-renders, because by default, it re-renders on every change. And really, that's what you want. For 95% of forms, it's not going to be that slow, because if you only have 10 or 15 fields, it's not going to be that slow. But there are some people that have contacted me about Redux Form that have forms with like 50 or 100 or 200 fields. And when it gets that big, it can start to get laggy. So let's look at how we can control the rendering. So I've got this little widget called render count. And all it does is it prints out how many times it itself has been rendered. So let's throw one on the form and one on each field row. Okay? So the circle at the top right is how many times the form has rendered, and the others next to each field are how many times that field has rendered. And this is 2 because the form had to render 1 time to get the fields to give it the field level validation, which then it had to run. So as I interact with the form, watch the numbers. With every single key press and every single focus or blur event, the whole form is re-rendering and all the fields are re-rendering. So how can we make this better? Well, both form and field components have a prop called subscription. And this is where we can pass, remember in the Final Form API, we can pass this object of Booleans. And the fact that we're destructuring our form state here makes it really easy to see exactly what we're using. So we're using submitting, and values. And this is an object, of course. Okay. So now when I focus on my fields, the whole form doesn't re-render, because before it was keeping track of which field had focus, but now it's no longer doing that. But as I type in the field, watch what happens. So why are all the fields re-rendering on every key press? Well, that's because we're subscribed to values, and anytime the values change, to print them out down here, we have to update the whole form. So we can't subscribe to values. So now watch what happens as I interact with the form. Each field only re-renders when it needs to. When I'm typing in this field, the other field doesn't care. And the whole form has only been rendered once in this whole time. And when I click submit, of course, the form has to re-render because we're subscribed to submitting. See, and then it has to re-render again when submitting becomes false. But in this way, we can control exactly what's happening. But what happened? We lost our values down here. We need some way to get form state from within a form without re-rendering the whole form, which you may remember was that thing that I said FormSpy does. So we get FormSpy, and down here where we're printing out our values, we wrap this in FormSpy. And we give it the subscription, and we say we care about values. And so that's going to give us a render prop with our values. And we can wrap our pre-tag here. And just for fun, let's put a render count in here so we can see how many times it renders. Okay, so now when I type in my form, the form is only re-rendered. The form is only rendered once. The fields are rendering on every time that they need to, and we still have our values down here. And it only renders when the values change, not when the focus changes. So that's pretty cool. Again, I stress that most forms don't need this level of fine-tuning, optimization, but you might end up with a use case with a whole bunch of form fields, in which case it can start to matter. So it's a thing to consider. So let's let's get rid of these render counts. And let me talk about the plugin capabilities. So one common problem with forms, if you get a big form where there's lots of fields and you have to scroll and you get down to the submit button and you click submit and there's a validation error, it doesn't matter that we've marked all the fields as touched. If the error is not on the screen, it's not easy for the user to know. And most people aren't going to say, hey, this isn't working. Maybe I need to go look for an error. No, people are just going to say, hey, your form's broken. So better UI would be to put a little error message next to the submit button saying, hey, there's errors up there, go look for them. Even better would be if you could scroll all the way up to the first error so that the user clearly sees where the error is. And even better would be if you could scroll up to the first error and focus on that field, so to take the user directly to what they need to be doing. Now, this is possible in React. So in order to focus on a field, you have to actually have a reference to the DOM element. So in React, to do that, you'd have to do a ref here and save the reference to the DOM node for all your inputs, and then when submission fails, you'd have to go and look up the first error and find that component, find that DOM node, and focus on it. But one of the plugins that is available for Final Form is called Final Form Focus, and it is a decorator. And the way you use a decorator is you create one. And you give it to form. So this takes decorators, and this takes an array of all the decorators that you want to use. Focus. OK, done. Our form now has that functionality. If I try and submit right now, it's going to display all the errors and take me to the input with the first error. And this has the side benefit of, as you go fixing the errors, like now if I hit return, it's going to try and submit the form, which is going to take me directly to the next error. So in that way, you can really help your users along actually getting the form to be valid. So I think it's time to go back to the presentation. Let's see if this key works again. Okay, we survived the live coding. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how and when to choose a form library, or any library really. You need to consider the complexity of the problem that you're trying to solve. If you just need a button that's going to change color when you click it, or some simple login form, you can probably manage all of that state yourself. But if you need a big calendar widget or a large registration form with complex validation rules, then it might be time to start looking for a pre-built, battle-tested solution on NPM. And your requirements might be lean and mean to start with, but I can assure you they're going to grow. And when you're evaluating a library, you have to ask yourself, does it look like the library is going to be able to grow to meet your inevitably more complex requirements in the future? And also, does it look like it's going to grow incrementally with you, rather than does it just do all this stuff so it's going to meet all your needs? It'd be better if, as you have more complicated needs, it could grow with you. And one way to measure how extensible a library is to look at the examples in the documentation. There are many things to love about Next.js, but one of my favorites is the examples directory in the repo. For almost any companion technology you can name, like all the Node web servers, Express and Koa and Happy, and all the CSS and JS libraries like Redux and Apollo, Glamour and style components and Emotion, and all the state management libraries like Redux and Apollo and Unstated and Redux Saga, they're all there. There's examples of how to use each of those with Next. And as a consumer, that gives me great confidence that Next.js as a platform is going to be flexible enough to grow as my requirements change in the future. Similarly, React Final Form currently has 34 different examples in the README, showing how it accommodates common use cases in forms. And this was partly how I battle tested it when I built it. I went back and I looked at all the use cases that I had learned about people requiring when I was working with Redux Form, and I made sure that React Final Form can handle all of those, plus more that Redux Form cannot. So another thing is bundle size. As I mentioned before, bundle size is not everything, but it's an important thing to consider. If you've got two similar looking libraries, choose the lighter weight one, because your users will appreciate it. Now, notice I haven't said anything about GitHub stars and NPM downloads. In my experience, that is generally because it would be great if they would like decay over time, but what you end up seeing is the older libraries that were once popular have a whole bunch of NPM downloads and stars, but it's not really a good metric. There could be newer, younger libraries that are better than the older ones that just don't have enough stars yet. So don't consider that. Probably the most important is, does the library have an emoji associated with it? No, I'm kidding. Really, the most important one is, does it make sense to you? Does it do you more or less understand what it's doing behind the scenes, and does it fit with your way of thinking about problems and problem solving? If one of them fits better, then pick that one. Now, normally I would end my talk here, but there's one more thing. So remember how I was talking about how having a self-contained FormState engine makes it really easy to adapt to future technology, and like maybe it could outlive React itself. Or hypothetically, what if the React core team were to invent a completely new way to manage component state, like they did a few weeks ago? With React hooks, it's a whole different way to think about components, and many tasks that once required complexities like higher order components or render props can be performed declaratively right in your render function. So, introducing React Final Form hooks. The entire API consists of two hooks, useForm and useField. And at considerably less than 1 kilobyte, it's the leanest possible way to connect Final Form to React. So let's look briefly at how to use it. This here is an entire form with similar functionality to the one we just built, all in one render function. First, with useForm, we get the form instance and also all of the form state. And then we use useField to get our field state. And our field state is an object that has this input and meta shape like we're used to in React Final Form. And then we spread our input into our input props, and then we can use the field state however we want elsewhere. So now, keep in mind that by design, obviously, with this pattern, it's going to cause your entire form to re-render on every key press. You can't do the same optimizations that you can with using the actual field components and form components and subscriptions and things. But like I said before, for the majority of forms, that's not an issue. And obviously, this is all still experimental, so you're not supposed to use it in production yet. So I'll leave you today with a tweet from one of the most important thought leaders in the React community, in the JavaScript community even. I think you know who I'm talking about. Form library authors are like anesthesiologists. They help people feel a little bit better when enduring an excruciating experience. So the reason to use a form library is that it handles so much of this state management drudgery for you, making it faster and easier to build forms. So you can get on to building the more fun parts of your application. Thank you very much. Спасибо.
We have a lot of time for questions, finally. Если кто-то стесняется спрашивать по-английски, мы можем перевести.
So, Erik, first of all, thank you for the awesome presentation. And my first question will be about Redux Form. What's going to happen to Redux Form? Are you going to support it? Are you going to develop it further? Are you going to transfer completely to final form?
Okay, Redux Form is still around. It's still useful. It still does all the stuff that it does. To be honest, there's not that much more. I mean, it's fairly feature complete. And I think adding more functionality to it is not for the reasons that I said before. It's just going to get it bigger and bigger. It is still maintained. I'm about to release a new version that follows the new dependency of. There's a new version of React Redux coming out. However, to be honest, I would recommend using Final Form over if you're starting a new project, but it's still there. And there are some use cases where it is better to use Redux Form if you really need to have access to your form state elsewhere in your application to be able to manipulate it. Then Redux Form is a better solution. But it's still around, it's still growing, it's still maintained. So. However, all of my personal applications I have migrated over. And the migration, like I was going to make a migration guide, but it's really just so easy because the API is so similar that it's pretty painless to migrate.
Thank you, Erik, for so great job, and demo was awesome. So the question is it possible right now, or do we have some plans in future? For example, if my application use MobX state tree or MobX, or for example, if I'm creating some complex relations between fields using RxJS or something similar, what do you think? Is it easy to use this component or not? And what should we think about it to use it? Because it already has a lot of features we need, but we don't use Redux. For example, if we use MST. Thank you.
Yes, there's a bunch of different plugins and things. Like there's ways to handle arrays of fields. There's way to do calculated fields. There's ways to listen to when this field gets to this value to change some other field. There's quite a few ways to add such functionality. As for putting your form state into MobX state tree, I mean, I guess you could. One of the examples is a way to just dump all of your form state into Redux, which is read-only. You don't get, with Redux Form, you can actually dispatch actions from elsewhere and modify your form state. But with this, is just read-only. It's just copying every time the form state changes to. So you could do something like that with MobX, I imagine. I don't know that much about MobX state tree, but it seems like it's going to be possible to hook in and make changes. So.
First of all, thank you. And the question is, developers still have to choose between Formic and Final Form. And from your side, what is the main difference? Maybe features, maybe pros, cons, whatever, and except bundle size. Since maybe it depends on the application, maybe.
Right. I used to have a comparison page, but then I read a blog post about how that's sort of mean to have a comparison page where your thing has more checks than the other people. But they're very, very similar in functionality. There's a couple things like tracking which field is active that Formic doesn't do. And the As far as I know, you can't do like what I was talking about, having sort of calculations happen to change other field values as you're changing. As far as I know, Formic doesn't do that. But Formic is a great library, and it's also well supported. So there's not that much difference. But you know, obviously mine is better.
Hi, thank you for the great library and the great presentation. Small question about the subscription model and how you describe subscriptions. Did you consider making it the same way, like Mobix discovers dependencies, like the dynamic way of discovering dependencies?
With proxies and things.
Yeah.
I did consider that, and it actually could be an interesting thing that could be built on top of the core engine. Haven't thought deeply enough about it, but that could be a cool thing.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for your work, I appreciate it. And I have maybe funny question, but while presentation, I saw valid and invalid both. Why?
You saw what?
Valid and
valid
invalid.
And invalid. Yes, it's the same way that I provide both dirty and pristine, which are opposites. They're not. The reason is that sometimes it's easier to reason about to think about your logic if you say if the field is invalid, then do this, as opposed to just not valid. There's no really strong reason, except it makes it easier to think about your logic. So,
going back to support and contributors, I noticed that Redux Form is under your personal GitHub account, but you have a dedicated organization for Final Form. Why is that? Do you plan to involve more people into contributing, acting as major contributors, some organizations?
That is a very good question. Mainly because there's lots of different repos involved with Final Form, and just to put them all together, and someone suggested that, and because I wasn't smart enough to make a mono repo, it's still me, but just to group the repos together in GitHub, not a great reason, but there's no organization.
Thank you for your talk. I just have to repeat the question you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation. So, is it only for React, or are there any other bindings like for Vue or Angular or something?
Great question. Because I really only know React, I've built one for React, but someone has built one for Vue. There is a Vue Final Form that's people are using. It's got downloads. Because I don't really use Vue, I can't tell you how good it is, but it does exist. As far as I know, there's nothing for Angular, but there's no reason why there couldn't be. I think Angular sort of has their own, official forms way of doing forms, so that might be hard to break into, but it's certainly possible.
Thank you.
And also, someone else has built a. Again, this requirement would not occur to me, but there's a thing that you can lay on top of Final Form that will provide type safety for your form values. Like, it guarantees that the values you get out match a certain TypeScript thing. But
I have one question. So you mentioned that any successful library have emoji, but do you have plans for stickers?
Stickers. I need to get stickers. I actually have some Redux Form stickers if anyone would like some. That is a great question, and I need to invest some of my vast sums of money that this is earning me.